Good evening. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Ishan Russell. Tonight, we talk about terrorism in the wake of what's been going on in Paris, especially after that horrific attack on Friday. There was another gun battle today. Meanwhile, the battle against the IS is raging on in Syria and Iraq. And the just concluded G20 summit also had terror and concerted global efforts to tackle it as the focal point. But the question really is whether the world is one in fighting terror. And today I'll pose this question to Pinak Ranjan Chakravarty, former secretary at the MEA and distinguished fellow at ORF, K.P.Nayar, consulting editor at the Telegraph, Professor Chintamani Mahapatra, chairman of the Center for Canadian, US and Latin American Studies at JNU, and Commodore Uday Bhaskar, Director, Society for Policy Studies. Ambassador, we'll put the question straight to you. Is the world one in fighting terror? Especially right after the G20 summit, we saw that communique that was put out, and it really said that, yes, as far as terror funding is concerned, as far as various other things are concerned, but still the big question remains as to who's responsible and who should be taking the fight to terror.
Well, rhetorically, yes. I mean, everybody says we must fight terror. But when it comes to implementation and when it comes to funding, when it comes to giving arms and ammunition, I'm afraid we are not one, because then geopolitics and national interests take over. So hence you have all kinds of jihadi groups being funded by countries like Saudi Arabia, even Turkey, the USA, and now France also has joined that effort. But of course, now since after the atrocities, the atrocious terrorist attacks in Paris, everybody is now again on a high, I would say, so that things look as if they are all determined to fight terrorism. How long this will last, I am afraid, I have my doubts. Bombing will not remove the IS, that's for certain. It will degrade them, as Obama keeps on saying, degrade, contain, etc., and finally destroy. But how do you destroy an ideology?
Right.
You cannot bomb an ideology out of existence. So they will remain in some form or the other. They may be routed and they may flee that place, but they will try to take root somewhere else. Perhaps in Yemen, where there is also a civil war, they've already taken root there. In Libya, perhaps, where they already have taken root. So there will be groups that will sprout up all over the place where the conditions are appropriate for this kind of a IS ideology to flourish.
All right, interesting point to make over there. And of course, it has to be a fix as far as responsibility is concerned, that who led to the creation of such a problem in the first place. But before we get into that, Commodore Bhaskar, today, as far as terror is concerned, it's not even a conventional understanding of terrorism. It's almost asymmetric warfare, as is often referred to in media. Now, what is that? And help our viewers understand that.
I think if we talk about the current phase, yes, it appears that there is a certain consensus, at least amongst the major powers, as we saw at the G20, that they will deal with the IS. But I would also add to what Ambassador Pinak has said, that this consensus is likely to be transient, meaning that you can have a certain amount of agreement on the tactical issue, which is to bomb Raqqa. Because if you recall, the so-called capital of the IS was first bombed by the Americans, then by the Russians, and now by the French. But it's not going to make a very big difference in terms of dealing with the core issue, if you will. And in the way in which this is now being conducted, I personally have long felt, going back to September 2001, the war on terror, in those days it had become GWOT, the Global War on Terror, was perhaps an unfortunate semantic in terms of the choice of phrase. Because is it right to talk about a war on a certain ideology which is animating these actors? At that time, the focus was on the Taliban. The Taliban morphed into the al-Qaeda.
Right.
Now the al-Qaeda has been replaced by the Islamic State, the Daesh, as the new challenge. So my reading is that while the conventional tools, air attacks, drones, is going on, the non-state entity, as we used to call it, which also is a misnomer, because the IS today controls a large swathe of territory which is almost as big as Great Britain. They have about 10 million reluctant or unwilling citizens. They have a financial flow. They are controlling oil. So it's a very different kind of an entity. Perhaps we should call it a semi-state or a quasi-state. Their capabilities have increased, meaning that what was once the subaltern, if you remember, the Americans could bomb the Taliban.
Right.
They said, we'll bomb you back into the Stone Age. The Taliban re-emerged. Today, the technological capability of the Daesh, the IS is much greater. So when we talk about the asymmetry part, Paris is a very good example about how the conventional state with all its capabilities is unable to prevent this kind of an onslaught whereby everything that the liberal democratic order stands for is being challenged.
Right.
And alas, as a security analyst, I would say that this challenge is only going to become more heightened, perhaps in the coming months, with this pattern of the current robust French military action. The Daesh has already put out threats. We know that yesterday in Washington there was a scare, which luckily turned out to be a non-IS related kind of issue. But these are the kind of patterns that we will see where this proxy war that we kept talking about is going to become more virulent in terms of how it will manifest itself.
All right, and it also means increased paranoia in the ordinary public, and that of course can create a whole new dimension to this problem. But Professor Mahapatra, as far as the root of the problem is concerned, and I think we all have a consensus on that needs to be addressed. Even Vladimir Putin said we should first understand how the IS was created, who started it, and that is where perhaps responsibility can be affixed. Right now, we've had a situation that for the past 15-20 years, the US and its allies have been waging war against so-called ideologies, and it has led to such problems.
You know, one of the problems is the moment you start digging up as to who is responsible, and suppose the one who is responsible happens to be a superpower or a hyperpower, what do you do about it? This is a big problem.
Right.
So, are we going to find out and put responsibility on country A or B, or now a menace has come which is threatening everyone, so let us team up? We have to raise the questions like that. Secondly, we all are talking about terrorism, whether the world is united. Terrorism itself is not monolithic. There are so many different types of terrorism. In some part, suddenly there is something happens in Paris and the whole world is talking about it. But when there was a bombardment in Beirut, how many people talked about it? In Baghdad, how many people talked about it?
Right.
Who talks about fighting Boko Haram? Right? So, it all depends what kind of terrorism, what kind of world, who are united and who are not united. Is Pakistan on board because it happens to be a strategic ally of the United States and fighting Taliban? It is not on board. And I can go on and on. So, the main issue is it is not just terrorism, it is not just the root cause of terrorism right now. We have been debating, writing books on this for donkey's years now. The main problem is this: two kinds of war are going on in the Middle East. One is against quote unquote so-called terrorists, the other one is against dictators. Now, let me put a question, whether fighting against dictatorship in the Middle East also leads to further expansion of terrorism in the region.
Right.
It is a point to think about it. If the US, instead of fighting al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, would not have gone into Iraq, removed Saddam Hussein, would Iraq be facing this kind of problem today? Is a big question mark. An Assad regime, which was surviving all kinds of fights by the non-state actors, if those non-state actors would not have got some kind of political support, moral support, or equipment support,
Right.
whether ISIL would have taken birth. So, in this two kind of war, we are seeing certain amount of double standard. So, we have to understand how best to fight it.
Okay.
Just one point more, ISIS. First time we are having a terrorist organization with a territory. Before that there was no territory. There is some governing structure, schools are open, colleges are open, people go and buy and sell in the market. So, are we going to brand it as just terrorism or something else?
Okay.
So, these are the points to ponder over.
Indeed, a lot of points to ponder over, but one of the points is just the fact that you can have young minds that are influenced or who are in a situation, KP, that is a problem of the collateral damage that the war on terror, the global war on terror, as Commodore Bhaskar was calling it, has led to this problem. And if we do not affix responsibility, if we do not address the root causes, then we keep building on a weak structure, don't we?
What you just said only reinforces what Pinak said in the beginning. I mean, being a diplomat, he was rather diplomatic about it, but I would go one step beyond and say that at the end of the day, there is no such thing as a global war on terror. No? I mean, it sounds nice, it's very good for a newspaper headline, but at the end of the day, the fight against terrorism is local, you know. I mean, you have to deal with the issue locally, you see, and there is no replacement, no substitute for human intelligence. because if you have effective human intelligence, you can deal with problem. At the end of the day, the actual planning and execution is going to take place in your locality, the locality which is subject to an attack. And if you have enough human intelligence, you can deal with it, you know. I suspect that part of the problem in Paris has been the absence of or inadequate, I won't say absence, inadequacy of human intelligence. You see, Western countries rely heavily on technology, whereas countries like India, Jordan, Egypt, which also face terrorism in a very severe way, deal with human intelligence, you know. Otherwise, you know, these suburbs, the suburb that was under police action today, police and army action today in Paris, it has been like a sitting time bomb, you know. And everybody knew that with unemployment among Maghreb immigrants in France, there was always the possibility of something like this happen. But how did the French fail in gathering human intelligence? And again, French have been probably the most effective in anti-terror activities. How they got rid of that terrorist regime in Mali, for example. I mean, it's been far more effective than the United States in Iraq, you see. Then the French have been very active in Lebanon at the time of Hariri as president. So only a reaction was inevitable. You know, if you mount a successful counter-terrorism drive, terrorists will focus on you. So why was not enough advance information not obtained? So I would say that at the end of the day, instead of talking about a global war on terror, we should talk about local war on terror. That is what is going to be the need of the hour, and that is what is going to be effective.
All right. And as far as terror is concerned, Ambassador, India has been trying to say that let's define terrorism. At least India has been pushing for it at the UN. But do you think in the wake of all this, at least that is something that the world could seriously put its head to and come to a definition of terrorism?
You know, that's again semantics. You know, how do you define terrorism? Because we've always had this problem of one man's terrorist being the other man's freedom fighter. And that is where the problem arises. You know, good terrorist, bad terrorist. If a terrorist serves my purpose, my interest, then he's all right. I mean, he's a non-state actor. He's not a terrorist anymore. So you use different labels. So countries who have been doing all these things have to now realize that terrorism as a tool, or sort of suddenly using these groups, jihadists and all, to serve a political purpose like regime change, for example, has led to what has happened in Syria, in Libya, in Iraq, and now Yemen also is similarly facing a civil war. Now, okay, I think it was mentioned that this is also a fight against dictatorships. One can go back to the Arab Spring. That's fine. I mean, Arab Spring was an expression of a certain democratic aspiration, which has led to certain regime changes. But that's fine, I think, because that is a local phenomena. It comes from the people. But where there is external intervention, like there was in Libya, or like there has been in Syria or Iraq, what has been left behind is complete devastation, because the countries have simply fallen apart. And then, because of geopolitical interests, you allow Saudi Arabia to bomb Yemen, without any, there is no sanction, no discussion. The United Nations is quiet. Of course, they have an envoy, a special envoy, trying to work out something, but he's not going to succeed till such time the US gives cover and patronage to the Saudis to go ahead and do this. Now, why did they do that? Maybe they needed the Saudis to tone down their criticism of the Iran deal. There are many, many such issues there. So it's a complex issue, and I think that the whole business of terror now needs to be, one has to refocus on it. And I think nations have to discard this business of good terrorists and bad terrorists. You know, your terrorist is bad, my terrorist is good because he's serving my purpose. So that aspect has to be now toned down. And I think Syria provides, a classic example of whether the world will be able to do something about it. And I think maybe perhaps the UN can be activated. You can have a legal instrument through the UNSC so that every country is now, comes on board, for example. So I think Prime Minister Modi was really expressing his frustration at all this, that, you talk about terrorism, there's grand rhetoric at G20, but what happens when it comes to implementation?
Absolutely. Commodore Bhaskar, the interesting point is that it's bringing democracy to these countries. That is often the guise that is used for that regime change, that also important regime change, but that really hasn't worked, and it has led to more complications. Now, as far as the global politics goes, we see Russia now becoming a stronger voice. Putin constantly saying that people in G20 also need to be held accountable of who financed the IS in the first place. So, do you see a tactical shift of power happening as far as global politics is concerned?
Well, I would say that perhaps what we are witnessing is a certain degree of tactical accommodation, meaning that pre-Paris, you could see that Moscow and Washington were on different sides as far as the Syrian issue was concerned. Post-Paris, and you could see some of these, I would say, signals, especially after the Russian aircraft, the one that took off from Sharm el-Sheikh and the ill-fated crash of that plane. Now we are being told that it was possibly a bomb that had been placed inside by the IS or its affiliates. So what I would characterize this is more as a tactical accommodation. We still do not have political consensus that while the bombing is going on and you have United States, Russia and France working in some degree of harmony as far as the air operations are concerned, the political objective is still not clear. Meaning, will Assad stay? Will Assad go? Will there be a transition? Because then you have other players, including Iran, which have a very clear stake in how this is going to play out. So I'm afraid, I keep saying this, the so-called unity that is being shown against terror per se is very transient. Meaning, in a couple of days from now, once the so-called military operation is over and there is a sense that the IS has been degraded, we will see yet another kind of, shall we say, contestation about the political objective. But one minor point, Ishan, while we have been talking about the excesses of regime change and what it has led to as far as West Asia is concerned, I want to reel back a bit and remind ourselves that when we had 9/11 and we had India's own experience and the Vajpayee government, the Kandahar hijacking, India was actually trying to find a way to deal with this issue. And post 9/11, when the Americans bombed Afghanistan, quote unquote, back into the Stone Age and ensured that there was regime change, the Taliban was no longer in power, India was an indirect beneficiary of that action.
Right.
Now, the unfortunate part, and I'm saying this more as an analyst in hindsight, perhaps the US made a huge blunder in not consolidating and moving on to Iraq, which is why from 2001 October, when that operation started, to where we are now in 2015 November, Afghanistan is facing the same kind of structural problems. So I think what we need to do is to step back as a global community and ask whether there are better ways of dealing with this, because this so-called, as you said, the guise of democracy can lead to many shall we say, intended consequences. And we have to, I suppose, identify, if I may use the word, the principal culprits. In this case, Pakistan.
Right.
To the extent the United States as a policy option has made this Faustian bargain and decided that they will engage with Pakistan, to the extent that General Rahil Sharif, the Pakistani army chief, is in Washington now as we speak, and he is trying to cut a deal whereby they will play a constructive role, which means the Taliban comes back into some kind of the power sharing arrangement in Kabul. So that's the irony. 14 years later, you want the Taliban back in power?
All right, Professor Mahapatra, but the point that Ambassador Chakravarty was also mentioning about the United Nations, and we might be a global community, but that global community I thought was represented by the United Nations. But increasingly it seems that United Nations is completely disregarded, and so as far as a global community, what's the platform?
You know, I can give you a long list of failures of the United Nations in tackling problem of law and order. United Nations is not the right kind of organization where one can go and fight terror. You know, people often use the term asymmetrical warfare. Asymmetrical against whom and who is really in the upper hand? In this kind of warfare, the terrorists appear to be on the upper hand actually. And after 15-20 years of fight in Afghanistan, if Taliban is still resilient and Iraq has become more unstable, and in Syria we are all seeing what is happening, and ISIL has taken birth, and then Boko Haram, and the list is longer, then what do we gain by saying asymmetrical? You know, in this kind of warfare, you don't use nuclear bomb, you don't use missiles, but the other side is well equipped to give you bloody nose every other day and kill people, innocent people, right? So, United Nations is a hotbed of politics. There, all nation states, although we call it global community, they go and look after and protect and promote their own interest. That is not the right kind of body. It is just, it gives a stamp of legitimacy. So before moving into Afghanistan, the Americans went to the UN and got some kind of legitimacy. But while going to Iraq, they said boo to the United Nations. Even the NATO members were opposed to it. Thousands and thousands of people in the US were opposed to the war. Even then, the government was determined to move in, and they moved in. So whenever it suits the purpose of a particular country, they go to the United Nations for legitimacy. At other time, if they know that UN is not going to support, then they go it alone. So I would argue that there is nothing called global community. It has to be the coalition of the willing, and the coalition of the willing will depend on the countries which are really victims of terrorism. There are not very many of them. And when you talk about global war on terrorism, it is not just, you know, countries going towards nook and corner of the world and fighting terrorism. In a way, the problem I see is terrorists going international.
Okay.
And whatever happened in Paris and we are discussing today, partly because the French were bombing ISIL in collaboration with Americans, in response to that, ISIL itself is spreading and taking war into different parts of the world, Bangladesh, and even Yemen, you know, Iraq,
Yeah, it's knocking at a door
Lebanon.
here.
So the war is spreading.
Okay. Indeed, the important point over there. But KP, as far as moving on from here is concerned, we seem to be on the consensus that there is no global community and each nation state will do as it pleases. But then how does one move from here? Because the situation is getting increasingly worrisome by the day, and an attack could happen at any place. And the root causes certainly aren't being addressed. Every nation state is advancing its own cause. So where do you see this fight headed?
Well, while there is no global community and there was some references to the failure of the United Nations, you see, United Nations can't be all things to all people, and there are limitations, inherently there are limitations to what the United Nations can do. But while that is true, you know, we have made incremental progress in our own war on terror within the United Nations. For instance, I recall that when we were in the Security Council the last time, there was a landmark change in the way the Security Council approached issues of terror, you know. Till we got into the Security Council, for example, when there was the Bali bombings, look at the statement, the PRST, the presidential statement issued by the Security Council. It, of course, condemns the Bali bombing. At the same time, it called upon the Indonesian government, while reacting to the bombing, to take into account the human rights of people, the values that are actually the Western values, you see. After one incident of terrorist bombing in Bombay, I remember our permanent representative at that time, Hardeep Singh Puri, it so happened that he was the president of the Security Council during that particular month. And he refused to endorse the standard statement, you know, about human rights and all that. You see, if one of the big five permanent members are attacked, when they are victims, this human rights thing was not there. It was only when developing countries, third world countries, people who are not the P5 were attacked that this was there. But on this occasion, Mr. Puri insisted that he will not accept this statement, that it should be the standard statement where there is unequivocal condemnation of terrorism, and everybody else had to accept it. Since then, it has changed. You know, now countries like India, which are victims of terrorism, are on the same footing, same level as United States or France or Russia or Britain. So we can use the United Nations.
Professor Mahapatra intensely disagrees with you. That
We
is
can
vigorously-
use the United
Okay.
Nations incrementally, but it is not impossible.
Okay, my final question, and Professor Mahapatra, you want to comment?
Just one or two lines. United Nations does not have a military, does not have a police force, does not have any enforcement agency. It will pass resolution and pass sentiments. That's it. Otherwise, it is the nation states who would have to take certain
All right, but
action.
then the question is, have the global powers, the powers that be who've led us to this crisis, have they been questioned enough in the United Nations itself? And I think that will lead to a whole other conversation. But one final question to you, Commodore Bhaskar. How do we see the world evolve from here? Because now we're seeing a paranoia attached to one community. There are young minds who are getting influenced, who've often felt victimized, who've been uprooted from their homes or traveling millions of miles. And in that sense, it's become a problem that is so multifaceted that to get a grip on it, how does the world tackle it?
Well, I think we should keep our hope in our democratically elected leaders. And what we saw in the G20 in Turkey perhaps is a glimmer of hope, that if there can be some kind of truth and reconciliation about past policies and ensure that the same short-term bargains, I often call them Faustian bargains, are not made, maybe we will see a way ahead. And in summary, I would say perhaps the way ahead for the world now is to deal with the ISIS immediately in a tactical manner, degrade them, strip them of their territory and quarantine the IS as we know it, and subsequently address all the other issues and look at Saudi Arabia and Pakistan as two examples of countries that have encouraged the ideology, because I think we have to remind ourselves that the war on terror is a non-starter. How do you deal with ideologies and the policy choices of countries such as Saudi and Pakistan, amongst others, who use support to such ideology as part of state policy? That might be the way ahead.
All right, gentlemen, we've absolutely run out of time, so I'm not being able to give you closing comments this time. But there is a broad consensus that the world needs to do a lot more, but that certainly is a question mark of which direction that is moving in. As Commodore Uday Bhaskar also said, that there is a certain glimmer of hope that has come out after the G20 summit. Now, whether the world moves together in a concerted effort to fight terror, we'll have to wait and watch. But thank you all of you for coming in today. And that's it from us. Goodbye.